The rain came down in sheets, pounding the city sidewalks until they gleamed like mirrors. Neon lights blurred in the puddles and hurried figures ducked beneath umbrellas, rushing to warmth, to shelter, to anything that promised escape from the cold sting of weather. Raymond Miller pulled the hood of his worn jacket tighter around his face. The fabric, frayed at the seams, was no match for the storm. His duffel bag, heavy with the few possessions he still called his own, pressed hard against his shoulder. Every step was deliberate, measured, a rhythm dictated by an old wound in his spine. He had grown used to the ache, but on nights like this, when the damp seemed to crawl into his bones, it became harder to ignore. He spotted a cafe glowing at the corner of the block. Its glass windows radiated the kind of comfort a man could only dream of. Warmth, laughter, the smell of coffee beans roasted fresh. The bell chimed as he stepped inside, bringing a swirl of wet air and the faint scent of the streets with him. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Behind the counter stood a young barista, his apron crisp, his smile polite but fragile, already fraying as his eyes swept over Raymond's soaked jacket, the scuffed boots, the unshaven jaw. "Water, please," Raymond said, his voice steady but soft, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to asking. "There's a minimum purchase," the barista replied, tilting his head toward a sign taped to the register. The words, "No free service, thank you," glared in bold black letters. Raymond reached into his pocket and unfolded a wad of bills, creased, damp, and short of pride. He pushed them forward. "Coffee, then, small." The barista hesitated, glancing toward a man seated at the corner table. This customer, dressed in a sharp suit, lowered his paper and wrinkled his nose. "He stinks," the man muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of discomfort passed through the cafe. No one spoke. No one intervened. The silence was worse than the insult. Raymond shifted his duffel to the floor. The zipper, already weakened, gave way under the strain, and the bag spilled its contents across the tile. Socks, a worn blanket, a weather-beaten photograph, and among them a small black box. It tumbled open with a metallic clink, revealing a medal, its ribbon faded but unmistakable. A purple heart. It lay gleaming under the cafe lights, a fragment of honor that seemed almost foreign in that space of judgment and indifference. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the barista stepped around the counter, not to help, but to nudge the items back toward the duffel with the toe of his shoe, as though the sight of them dirtied the floor. Raymond crouched carefully, wincing at the pull in his back. His fingers closed around the metal, and he pressed it against his chest. The ribbon was frayed, but the weight was familiar. Grounding. "I didn't mean to," the barista began, his voice uncertain now, laced with a flicker of guilt. Raymond's gaze rose, steady, piercing through the layers of pity and disdain. "Don't apologize to me," he said quietly, the words carrying more force than any shout. "Apologize to the uniform." No one answered. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. He stood slowly, slipping the metal back into its case, tucking it deep inside the duffel as though returning it to a safe harbor. Without another word, he slung the strap over his shoulder. The coffee, the water, the warmth, none of it mattered anymore. As he turned, the suited man clicked his tongue and shook his head, muttering, "Crazy old soldier." The bell chimed again as Raymond stepped into the storm. Rain swallowed him whole, but he walked upright, each step measured, deliberate. The humiliation clung like a second skin, but so did his dignity. Behind the glass, the cafe resumed its rhythm. Conversations rose again, chairs scraped against the floor, cups clinked. Yet an uneasy shadow lingered, a faint echo of the moment when silence had revealed the truth. A man carrying scars no one could see had been treated as though he were less than human. Raymond walked until the lights of the cafe blurred into the darkness. The metal pressed against his ribs, a silent reminder of battles fought far from these indifferent streets. He found no shelter waiting, no welcome arms, only the relentless rain. But even as water ran in rivulets down his face, there was no bitterness in his eyes, only the hard-won calm of someone who had endured worse than cold stares and closed doors. He reached a small park, its gazebo barely visible through the downpour. There he paused, shook the rain from his hood, and lowered himself onto the wooden bench. The duffel landed beside him with a dull thud. He rested both hands on it, as though guarding something precious. In the distance, car horns and sirens wove the city's restless soundtrack, indifferent to the man sitting alone under the shelter. His breath rose in slow, steady clouds, mingling with the mist of the storm. The metal, once more hidden, seemed to pulse with memory. Raymond leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams of the gazebo, listening to the rain strike above him like the echo of far-off gunfire. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the cafe faded away. The city, the insult, the silence. All of it dissolved, leaving only the weight of sacrifice and the faint, unshakable pride of service. The storm raged on, but Raymond endured, as he always had. The storm slackened toward midnight, leaving only a steady drizzle that streaked the city lamps with liquid halos. The park grew quiet, emptied of strollers, joggers, and couples. Only Raymond remained beneath the gazebo, his duffel like a faithful dog at his side. He rubbed his palms together, coaxing warmth from friction, then unzipped the bag with careful hands. Inside were the fragments of a life lived in uniforms and silence. He pulled them out one by one, arranging them on the bench as though conducting a roll call. The Purple Heart lay in its case, its ribbon still damp from the cafe floor. Beside it, he placed a neatly folded flag, its star pressed sharp against the fabric. It had been handed to him years ago, after a burial that should never have been necessary. He smoothed a corner of it, as though the act might smooth the ache in his chest. A photograph came next. 12 men stood shoulder to shoulder, arms slung across one another's backs, grinning with the cocky bravado of soldiers too young to know how fragile life could be. They wore desert fatigues, dust clinging to boots, sun glinting off helmets. Raymond traced a finger across the faces. 7 of those smiles were gone, buried in foreign soil. 5 remain, scattered like seeds across the country, each carrying scars of survival. The last item was a letter, its envelope softened by handling. He unfolded it carefully, the paper threatening to tear along creases worn from countless readings. Dear Dad, I don't care what you think about yourself. You'll always be my hero. I hope one day you'll let me see you again. Love, Sophia. Her handwriting curved in loops, innocent and insistent at once. He held the page close, the words blurring as the drizzle sprayed sideways into the gazebo. He had read this letter enough to know every stroke of ink, yet it still pierced him. The longing in her words reminded him of the distance he had created, not only miles but years of silence built on pride and guilt. Still holding on to ghosts, Sergeant? The voice startled him. He looked up to see a man easing himself onto the opposite bench, a weather-beaten cap pulled low over his brow. The man's limp was subtle but recognizable, the kind a veteran could spot without effort. His jacket bore a patch so faded it was more memory than cloth. Charlie? Raymond's brow furrowed as recognition dawned. Alpha 9, wasn't it? The man chuckled, a deep, weary sound. Thought I recognized that stiff spine of yours. What's it been, 15 years? Raymond allowed the faintest smile. Closer to 20. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain patter against the roof. The bond between them required no words. Shared service forged connections that time and distance could never fully sever. Charlie finally nodded toward the scattered items. Still carrying the weight, huh? Raymond gathered the photograph and flag, returning them carefully to the duffel. Some things are too heavy to put down. Or maybe you're too stubborn to try. Charlie's tone was light, but his eyes were sharp. We all carry it, Ray. Difference is, some of us let others help with the load. Raymond gave a dry laugh. Help isn't free. Costs pride. And pride's about the only thing I've got left. Charlie leaned back, stretching his legs. You'd be surprised how much pride you can keep while letting someone care. Hell, I've been writing that line for years. Keeps me off the street. Keeps me from drinking myself into the grave. Raymond said nothing. The words brushed against a wound he preferred to ignore. Charlie changed tack, fishing a battered smartphone from his pocket. You seen this yet? He tapped the screen and turned it toward Raymond. There, captured in shaky, vertical footage, was Raymond's confrontation at the cafe. His duffel spilling, the metal flashing, the barista's coldness in his quiet words. Apologize to the uniform. The video had already racked up thousands of views. Comments scrolled in real time. Some called him a fraud. Others mocked his appearance. A few defended him, but their voices were drowned in jeers. Raymond's jaw tightened. So that's what I am now. A joke for strangers. Charlie shook his head. No, you're a mirror. People see you and it shows them who they are. Some don't like the reflection. Raymond closed his eyes briefly. He had fought in valleys where gunfire echoed off stone, carried brothers through smoke and dust, endured surgeries and sleepless nights. Yet nothing had cut so sharply as seeing his dignity reduced to entertainment. Across the city, another man scrolled the same video. David Harrison, once a wide-eyed private in Raymond's unit, paused when recognition struck. The man in the grainy clip had once carried him across a mountain after an IED tore away his leg. Without Raymond, David would have bled out in the dirt, nameless and forgotten. Now he watched his rescuer shamed for daring to exist among those who owed him respect. David's throat tightened. He opened his contacts and dialed. Rodriguez, it's Harrison. You need to see this. The call sparked a chain reaction. One by one, names lit up across old networks. Emails flew, group chats buzzed, private forums filled with messages. Men and women who had once worn the same patches, who had sweated under the same sun and bled in the same dust, all saw the same video. By dawn, plans were already forming. Vehicles were readied, uniforms pressed, ribbons pinned. Solidarity, once dormant, rose like a tide. Back under the gazebo, Raymond leaned against the bench, exhaustion pressing on him. Heavier than rain. He pulled his coat tighter and lay down, the duffel tucked against his chest. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by faces of the fallen, broken by the echo of voices that had never returned. The metal rested inside, cold against fabric, while outside the city turned, unaware of the quiet storm gathering among those who refused to forget their own. The first light of morning crept between buildings, soft and pale, painting the wet streets in silver. Commuters were just beginning to stir, taxis honking in impatient bursts, delivery trucks backing into narrow alleys. To most of the city, it was an ordinary dawn. To Raymond Miller, curled stiffly on the gazebo bench, it was another day to endure. But for others, this day had been marked with purpose. Engines growled as 5 military-style transport trucks rolled slowly down the block where the cafe stood. Their tires hissed against wet pavement, headlights cutting through the lingering mist. People paused on sidewalks, drawn by the sight of the convoy. Cell phones lifted instinctively, capturing the unusual procession. The trucks came to a stop, sealing off the street as though forming a protective wall. Doors opened, boots struck the ground in unison, and a wave of veterans emerged. 50 men and women, their uniforms spanning decades of service, lined up with a precision that no rehearsal could have improved. Some bore fresh ribbons. Others carried the weathered insignias of long-ago campaigns. Together they stood as one body, a living timeline of sacrifice. At their head was Lieutenant Colonel Carla Rodriguez. Her presence commanded attention before she even spoke. Years of service etched into her posture, ribbons cascading down her chest. She carried herself with the composure of someone who had seen combat yet refused to let its weight bow her. She scanned the gathered crowd, shoppers, workers, students, all now silent, staring at the unfolding scene. Rodriguez stepped forward, voice carrying clear and firm. This establishment, she said, gesturing to the cafe behind her, chose yesterday to humiliate a man who has given more to this country than most could ever imagine. His name is Sergeant First Class Raymond Miller, 10th Mountain Division, retired. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Phones zoomed in. Rodriguez continued, unwavering. Sergeant Miller carried soldiers through fire and shrapnel. He fought in the frozen mountains where the air itself cut like a blade. He was decorated with the Purple Heart after surviving wounds that nearly shattered his body. And when he came home, like too many of us, he found himself invisible. Seen only when convenient, discarded when uncomfortable. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Behind her, the line of veterans stood silent but resolute, their presence louder than any applause. This uniform, Rodriguez said, her hand brushing the fabric at her chest, is not fabric. It is not thread. It is blood, sweat, bone, and sacrifice. Yesterday, Sergeant Miller asked for nothing but a cup of water. He was met with disdain. Today, we are here to remind you that he and every man and woman who has worn this cloth deserves respect. From a nearby truck, 2 veterans carried a wooden placard and set it firmly at the cafe entrance. Burned into the grain were the words, "This place refused a hero. We remember." The barista from the night before stood behind the counter, pale and shaken. He had thought the incident over, forgotten once the man walked into the rain. Now an entire block bore witness to his choice. He stepped hesitantly to the doorway, apron twisted in nervous hands. I, I didn't mean, he stammered, eyes darting to Rodriguez, then into the line of veterans, then to the growing crowd. I didn't know who he was. From the edge of the formation, Raymond himself appeared. He had been found that morning by David Harrison and driven here without explanation. Now he stepped forward, duffel slung across his shoulder, Purple Heart pinned firmly to his jacket. His gait was uneven, his expression calm but unyielding. The barista's words faltered as Raymond's gaze met his. Silence stretched until Raymond broke it with quiet steel. Apologize to everyone who ever wore it. He tapped the metal, its ribbon catching the morning light. The words cut deeper than any rebuke. The barista swallowed hard, lips moving without sound, before lowering his eyes and stepping back inside. The crowd pressed closer, some clapping hesitantly, others whispering into their phones. What had begun as a spectacle was becoming something heavier, a lesson unfolding in real time. David Harrison stepped forward, leaning on a cane. The metal prosthetic beneath his trousers caught a glint of light. His voice was steady, carrying the kind of truth that required no embellishment. "Sergeant Miller saved my life," David said. "An IED tore through our convoy. I was down, bleeding out, ready to be another name etched in stone. He carried me, miles, up a mountain, under fire, carried me until a medevac could get us out. I breathed because he refused to leave me behind." Gasps rose from the onlookers. Some clutched their chests, others wiped at their eyes. Another veteran stepped out of formation, sleeves rolled to reveal tattoos of unit crests and fallen brothers' names. "I didn't serve with him," the man said, nodding toward Raymond, "but I know his kind. Quiet warriors who take the weight so others can go home. We all know someone like him. We all owe someone like him." The testimonies built one after another. A woman in a desert camo jacket spoke of nights intense, lit only by fear and hope. A gray-haired man described the silence after firefights, when counting the living felt harder than mourning the dead. Each voice wove a thread into a tapestry too rich to ignore. Inside, cafe staff fumbled with trays of coffee and pastries, rushing to offer them free of charge. Rodriguez raised a hand, stalking them gently. "We didn't come for coffee," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We came for respect." Her words landed with finality. The staff froze, realizing generosity meant nothing when dignity had already been denied. By noon, the convoy began to disperse. Trucks rumbled back to life, veterans climbing aboard in silence. The placard remained at the door, a scar carved into wood, warning future patrons not to forget what had happened. But the internet did not wait for memory to fade. The same cameras that had captured Raymond's humiliation now recorded his vindication. Clips spread like fire across feeds and channels. Hashtags rising. #respect the uniform. #invisible heroes. #Raymond Miller. The narrative shifted overnight. Where mockery had once filled comment sections, now strangers wrote messages of gratitude, of apology, of reflection. Some admitted they had looked away when passing a veteran on the street. Others promised to see differently from now on. Raymond watched none of it. He stood at the edge of the dispersing crowd, metal pinned over his heart, face unreadable. Yet inside, something stirred. Not triumph, not relief, but the faintest sense that perhaps he had not been entirely forgotten. The city had seen him, and more importantly, the city had listened. By early afternoon, the block outside the cafe still buzzed with energy. Commuters slowed their steps, drawn to the residue of something extraordinary. The placard at the entrance stood like a sentinel, its carved words stark against polished wood. "This place refused a hero. We remember." Raymond lingered near the curb, shoulders squared beneath his faded jacket, Purple Heart shining like a beacon against the gray. He did not seek attention. He merely stood, silent, watching as the crowd swelled and contracted in waves. But others had stories to tell, and one by one they stepped into the open air to give them voice. David Harrison was the first. His cane tapped lightly on the pavement as he turned toward the spectators. His voice carried the gravelly weight of memory. I was 20 years old when a bomb tore through our convoy in the mountains. Smoke, fire, chaos, everything burned. I thought I was gone. But Sergeant Miller here, he pointed to Raymond, his hand trembling slightly. He wouldn't let me go. He threw me over his shoulder and carried me through the dirt and the blood. He didn't stop when bullets cut the air. He didn't stop when his own back gave out. He carried me until the helicopter lifted us both away. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A woman pressed a hand to her lips. A man lowered his phone, realizing the weight of the moment couldn't be captured by pixels. David's eyes shone with the kind of gratitude that could never fade. I live because of him. My kids have a father because of him. And yesterday this city watched him beg for a cup of water like he was less than human. His voice cracked. If that doesn't make you stop and think, then nothing will. Applause erupted, not thunderous but steady, like a heartbeat rising from the crowd. Another figure emerged, a tall man with sleeves rolled high, revealing faded tattoos of unit crests inked across his arms. His voice was rough, but every word landed like truth. I didn't serve with Miller, but I served with men like him, quiet men who shouldered the weight so the rest of us could come home. Men who never asked for parades, never asked for applause, just the chance to live in peace. Every time one of us is ignored, mocked, or shoved aside, it's all of us who bleed again. His words struck deep. People nodded, some wiping at their eyes, others shifting uncomfortably as guilt tugged at them. A woman stepped forward next. She wore desert camouflage, patches faded but intact. Her hair was streaked with silver, her stance steady. I remember nights in tents so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Nights when silence was louder than any mortar, because you were counting who made it back and who didn't. Men like Sergeant Miller carried us through those nights, and now he carries something heavier than packs or weapons. He carries the silence of a country that forgets too easily. Her voice didn't rise, but it resonated like the low note of a drum. People leaned in, straining not to miss a syllable. From the crowd, an elderly man wearing a ball cap with faded stitching stepped forward. He wasn't part of the organized formation. He was just another passerby who recognized the weight of the moment. He raised his trembling hand in a salute. No words, no explanations, just a simple gesture of respect. It spread like a spark. Others followed, awkwardly at first, then steadily, hands pressed to hearts, heads bowed. Inside the cafe, the staff scrambled. They carried trays of steaming cups, paper bags filled with pastries, desperate to soften the edges of their mistake. They pushed them toward the veterans, offering free drinks, free food, free anything to erase the sting. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez raised her hand, stopping them gently. Her tone was calm but unyielding. We didn't come for coffee. We came for respect. The words landed with finality. The trays were lowered, hands falling limp. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that no amount of generosity could undo what had been done. By now, the gathering was more than a protest. It had become a classroom without walls. Strangers learned in real time what sacrifice looked like, what dignity demanded, and how fragile respect could be when withheld. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, whispering explanations about the men and women standing proud before them. Teachers in the crowd pulled out notebooks, scribbling thoughts they knew they'd share later in classrooms. The city was listening. When the convoy finally began to disperse, it wasn't with chants or banners. It was with silence. The kind of silence that leaves a deeper mark than any noise. The veterans returned to their trucks, boots thudding in rhythm, uniforms catching the light. The placard remained, its message seared into wood and memory alike. Yet the story didn't end on the sidewalk. The internet, once filled with ridicule, now overflowed with awe. Videos of the veterans lined up outside the cafe spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended. #respect the uniform, #invisible heroes, #Raymond Miller. Comment sections shifted tone, once cruel, now flooded with words of gratitude, apology, and reflection. People admitted their blindness. Some shared stories of relatives who had served, confessing shame at how rarely they thought about them. Others promised to do better, to look differently at the men and women who carried invisible scars. The cafe's reputation crumbled. Review sites overflowed with criticism, not from malice but from a demand for accountability. Yet amid the anger, there was also a current of hope, an insistence that maybe this moment born of humiliation could turn into something larger. For Raymond, the whirlwind was both surreal and distant. He didn't watch the videos, didn't scroll through the comments, didn't measure his worth in trending tags. He simply sat on the curb as the trucks rolled away, the metal pressed against his chest, his breath steady. The city had seen him. The city had listened. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within, a flicker of recognition not just from others, but from himself. He wasn't invisible anymore. The rain had passed, leaving the city streets rinsed clean, the sky clear for the first time in days. The air carried a sharp coolness that hinted at change, though for Raymond Miller, change had always come like an ambush, sudden, disorienting, impossible to prepare for. When David Harrison drove him across town that evening, Raymond assumed it was to another shelter, another cot lined up among strangers, another temporary solution. But when the car pulled up before a modest brick building with narrow balconies and windows that glowed warmly from within, he frowned. "This isn't the shelter," he muttered, glancing toward David. "No," David answered simply, pushing the gear into park. "It's yours." Raymond turned sharply. "Mine?" David held out a small ring of keys. Metal jingled as they caught the fading light. "We pulled together what we could. The guys, Rodriguez, a few of the others. We found this unit, paid the first year's rent. You've got a door, a bed, a fridge, everything you need to start over." Raymond stared at the keys, his chest tightening. Pride rose like a wall inside him, instinctive, unyielding. "I don't need charity." David's eyes were steady, patient. "It's not charity. It's what you earned 100 times over. You carried me when I had nothing left. Let us carry you now." For a long moment, Raymond didn't move. Then slowly, his hand reached out. The keys felt heavy, heavier than any weapon he had carried. Heavier than the duffel that had cut into his shoulder all those miles. Inside, the apartment was modest but whole. A bed with crisp sheets stood against one wall. A small table with 2 chairs sat by the window, and the refrigerator hummed quietly, stocked with basics. For the first time in 18 months, Raymond closed the door behind him and heard the click of a lock that belonged to him. The silence inside was overwhelming. He set his duffel down gently, almost reverently, and sat on the edge of the bed. His back sank into the mattress, softer than any surface he'd known in years. The weight of exhaustion pressed into him, but sleep would not come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, grappling with the dissonance of comfort after so much deprivation. The next morning, when sunlight streamed across the room, Raymond rose and made the bed with military precision. Old habits lingered, etched into his muscle memory. He folded corners tight, smoothed the blanket flat, lined the pillow just so. It was a ritual of control, of order, something he could master even when the world felt unsteady. Throughout the week, veterans rotated visits. One dropped off breakfast sandwiches. Another offered a ride to the VA clinic. Rodriguez herself arrived with paperwork for benefits long overdue. Each gesture scraped against his pride, but slowly, quietly, Raymond began to accept them. Not as charity, but as fellowship. Meanwhile, across town, the cafe transformed. The owner, stung by public outrage and humbled by the veterans' demonstration, initiated staff training, sessions on respect, on recognizing invisible wounds, on the weight carried by those who had served. A table near the window was designated for veterans, not in ceremony but in quiet invitation. Each morning a handful gathered there, men and women in caps, jackets, with patches and pins, talking softly over steaming cups. They did not bring up the incident. They did not need to. Their very presence was reminder enough. One afternoon, a father brought his young son into the cafe. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of a veteran saluting another across the room. "Why do they do that?" he whispered. The father crouched, his voice gentle. "Because sometimes a man is the flag." Raymond heard the words later, relayed by a friend, and felt something shift inside him. Pride no longer seemed like a fortress keeping people out. It felt instead like a bridge built from recognition. Weeks passed, letters began arriving at his new address, some from strangers who had seen the video, others from veterans who simply wanted him to know he was not alone. One envelope, however, struck deeper than all the rest. The handwriting was familiar, curved in looping strokes that he had traced countless times in memory. His daughter, Sophia. With trembling hands, he tore it open. "Dad, I saw the video. I cried through the whole thing. You don't know how long I've prayed the world would see you the way I do. I'm proud of you. I always was. I'm taking time away from school. I need to be with you. Please let me help carry the weight you've carried alone. Love, Sophia." The words blurred as moisture welled in his eyes. He sat at the small table, letter clutched tight, chest heaving with a mix of grief and relief. He had built walls around himself for so long, walls of guilt, of silence, of fear that he had failed as a father. Now with one letter, those walls cracked. That night, Raymond sat at the window of his apartment, city lights glowing like distant stars. He read Sophia's letter again and again, each time feeling the fortress of solitude crumble further. He imagined her laughter echoing in these rooms, her presence filling the silence. The thought frightened him, but it also healed. The next morning when Rodriguez visited, she found him sitting straighter, eyes clearer. "She's coming home," he told her, voice rough but steady. Rodriguez smiled. "Good, you've carried enough alone." In the cafe that same morning, veterans gathered at their usual table. The barista who had once pushed Raymond's duffel with his shoe approached quietly, setting down steaming mugs without a word. His hand shook slightly, but he did not retreat. One of the veterans looked up, nodding. "Thank you." The barista nodded back, voice barely audible. "Respect." The moment was small, but it mattered. Change was not a banner waved in triumph. It was a cup of coffee placed gently, a word spoken with humility, a silence broken by acknowledgement. Raymond watched from across the street as the exchange unfolded. He saw the barista linger, saw the veterans welcome him into their quiet circle. For the first time, he felt not anger, but forgiveness stirring inside him. Even those who faltered could learn to stand again. That evening, back in his apartment, Raymond opened his duffel one last time. He pulled out the Purple Heart and set it on the bedside table. It no longer felt like a relic of pain, but a reminder of endurance. He unfolded the flag and laid it across the dresser, its stars shining against the dim light. The photograph of his unit he propped against the mirror, their young faces grinning at him as if urging him forward. Uit. When sleep finally came, it was deep and unbroken. For the first time in years, he dreamed not of war, not of loss, but of home. Morning sunlight spilled through the beams of Raymond Miller's small apartment, painting long bars of gold across the floor. The city was already awake, horns blaring, vendors shouting, shoes striking pavement. But inside, the world felt quieter, gentler. Raymond sat at the table, Sophia's letter open before him. The edges were worn from being handled too many times in too few days, but the ink still carried her voice clearly. He read it again, lips moving silently with each word. The pride, the longing, the invitation, it all pressed against him like a tide. For the first time in years, he didn't resist. The Purple Heart rested beside the letter. It no longer felt like a hidden relic tucked away in a duffel. Now it gleamed openly on the wood, not as a wound, but as a declaration. Raymond's hand hovered over it, then shifted to his phone. His thumb hesitated above the keypad, nerves clashing with hope, before finally pressing the screen. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago but never used. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, breathless, younger than he remembered yet steady with strength. He swallowed hard. "Sophia, it's Dad." There was silence, then a gasp. "Dad, you called." "I should have sooner," he admitted, his voice low, thick with unspoken years. "But I saw your letter. I think I'm ready for you to come home." He heard her cry, not of pain but of relief. "I'm already packing," she said, laughter and tears tangled together. "I'll be there soon." When the call ended, Raymond sat motionless, phone still clutched in his hand. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of anticipation, of something long buried now breaking the surface. A knock at the door broke the moment. When he opened it, Lieutenant Colonel Carla Rodriguez stood with her usual commanding presence, a folder tucked beneath her arm. "You look different," she said, eyes narrowing with approval. Raymond shrugged. "Maybe I feel different." "Good, because the city needs you." She handed him the folder, thick with papers and official seals. The mayor's office reached out. They want to turn what happened into something lasting. A program for veterans, housing, jobs, outreach. They asked for someone who knows what it feels like on the ground. I gave them your name. Raymond blinked, startled. "Me?" "You," Rodriguez confirmed. "As an advisor. Paid position. Real voice in the room." He shook his head, reflexive resistance rising. "I'm not qualified. I've been living on benches, not drafting policies." Rodriguez's tone sharpened. "You're qualified because you know the weight, because you've lived what too many pretend to understand. That's worth more than any polished resume." He looked down at the folder, thumb tracing the edge of the cover. "It feels like charity." "It's not charity," Rodriguez countered firmly. "It's responsibility. This city owes its veterans more than applause and hashtags. You can help make sure it pays that debt." Her words struck him with the clarity of command. He had resisted help, resisted recognition, resisted his own worth. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about every man and woman still invisible, still slipping through the cracks. Raymond exhaled slowly. "When's the meeting?" "Tomorrow morning," Rodriguez said, satisfaction flickering across her face. "And don't think you can hide behind excuses. I'll pick you up myself." After she left, Raymond sank back into his chair, folder in hand. The idea of stepping into an office, of speaking to officials, felt foreign, almost absurd. Yet the more he thought of Sophia's words, "Let me help share the weight," the more the path began to make sense. That evening he walked to the park. Children spilled across the grass, their laughter rising above the hum of traffic. He sat on a bench watching them chase one another, tumble into the dirt, leap up again with unbroken joy. He remembered the young faces in the photograph tucked in his duffel, remembered the laughter that once echoed through barracks before battles stole it away. For years, he had believed his story ended the day he hung up his uniform. But perhaps it was only now beginning again. The next morning, Rodriguez arrived in a dark sedan, uniform immaculate, voice brisk as always. "Ready?" Raymond adjusted the collar of his jacket, Purple Heart pinned firmly at his chest. "As ready as I'll ever be." The mayor's office loomed larger than he expected, its polished steps crowded with reporters. Cameras clicked as soon as they spotted the pair. Questions flew. "Sergeant Miller, how do you feel about the Café incident? What changes do you want to see?" But Rodriguez waved them aside. Inside, the atmosphere was different. City officials sat around a long table, their faces attentive, some cautious, others openly eager. Papers, charts, and proposals were spread before them, but the room fell silent when Raymond entered. He cleared his throat, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. But then he remembered the faces in the photo, the letter from Sophia, the veterans who had stood shoulder to shoulder outside the cafe. He straightened his spine and began. "I don't know the language of politics," he said, voice steady, "but I know what it feels like to sleep on a bench with nothing but a medal in your pocket. I know what it feels like to be treated like a problem instead of a person. And I know too many men and women who wore the same uniform I did are still living that way." The room listened, silent, no interruptions. "You can call it a program, a policy, an initiative, whatever words fit, but don't forget what it really is. It's a lifeline. It's a door with a lock. It's a place where someone can sit down and remember they matter." His voice grew rougher, but he didn't falter. "You want advice? Start by looking at us. Not through us, not past us. See us, respect us. That's where it begins." When he finished, the silence lingered. Then slowly one official nodded, another murmured agreement, a third began scribbling notes. Rodriguez sat tall, pride clear in her eyes. By the end of the meeting, commitments were on the table. Funds for veteran housing, programs for job training, resources for mental health. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, a seed planted in fertile ground. As Raymond stepped back into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not gone, never gone, but shared. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was building. That evening, he called Sophia again. I went to the meeting, he told her. They listened. I think I found something useful to do. Her laughter filled the line, warm and unguarded. I knew you would. And for the first time in years, Raymond smiled without restraint. The cafe looked different in the late afternoon light. The same glass windows still reflected the bustle of the street. The same bell still chimed softly each time the door opened. But the air inside carried something new. A quiet awareness, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. The barista who once shoved a duffel with his shoe now moved differently. His steps were slower, more deliberate, his eyes searching faces with care. At the counter, he noticed an elderly man with a Vietnam service pin fastened to his jacket. The man's shoulders stooped from years of labor. His hands trembled slightly as he placed $1 on the counter for a black coffee. Before the man could say more, the barista reached for a mug. He poured the coffee himself, not in haste but with attention, setting it gently on the counter. On the house, sir, he said, voice low but steady. The veteran looked up, startled. His brows lifted in surprise, but before he could object, another voice rose from a nearby table. Join us! A group of veterans, scattered across chairs near the window, waved the man over. Their caps bore unit names, their jackets carried stories stitched into patches. The elderly man hesitated, then nodded and carried his cup to their table. The barista watched as they welcomed him with a nod and a place among them. He swallowed hard, then returned to his work, his heart heavier, but somehow lighter all at once. Outside, Raymond stood across the street, watching through the glass. He had not stepped inside again, not since that stormy night, but he no longer felt anger when he looked at the cafe. He saw instead what it had become. Not perfect, but changed. A place learning, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. Rodriguez joined him on the sidewalk, her uniform jacket slung casually over one shoulder. Not bad, she remarked, following his gaze. Not bad, Raymond echoed. For weeks, he had been meeting with officials, helping shape the program that would soon roll out citywide. Housing units designated for veterans, job training partnerships, counseling services tailored for those carrying invisible wounds. All of it was taking the root because of one incident in the rain. He never would have believed humiliation could lead to healing. Yet here he was, proof that scars could guide others if only they were seen. Back in his apartment, Raymond unpacked fully for the first time. He opened the duffel that had been his constant companion and began placing its contents around the room. The Purple Heart sat proudly on the bedside table, no longer hidden but displayed. The folded flag found its place across the dresser, its stars sharp against the wood. The photograph of his unit leaned against the mirror, their young faces grinning as if urging him forward. For years, those items had been burdens, reminders of pain and loss. Now, in this new space, they became anchors, proof of endurance, proof that even the heaviest loads could be carried long enough to find light again. Sophia arrived a week later. The knock at the door startled him, though he had been waiting for it every moment since their call. When he opened the door, she stood there with a suitcase in one hand and a smile that carried both joy and sorrow. Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't trust his own words, so he reached for her instead, pulling her into an embrace that spoke what silence could not. She clung to him, tears wetting his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Raymond allowed himself to believe he was not alone. That evening, they sat together at the small table, sharing a meal she had cooked. The conversation wandered from trivial things, her classes, the city streets, the stubborn squeak of his apartment floor, to heavier truths. He told her about the nights on benches, about the silence he had wrapped himself in like armor. She listened without judgment, her hands steady on his, her eyes full of patience. You don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore, she said softly. He nodded, the words settling into him like balm. Maybe I never did. I just didn't know how to let anyone else help. Days turned into weeks. The program gained momentum. Veterans stepped forward to share their stories, and the city began to notice them in ways it hadn't before. The placard outside the cafe remained, weathered by sun and rain, its message a constant reminder to those who entered. Teachers brought students to see it, explaining the story behind the words. Families paused to read it aloud. It became less a scar and more a marker, a signpost of change. Raymond found himself busier than he had been in years. Meetings, interviews, community gatherings. His days filled with purpose instead of emptiness. At night, he returned to his apartment, where Sophia's laughter echoed off the walls, filling spaces that had once known only silence. One evening, he and Rodriguez walked through the park where he had once slept under the gazebo. Children played tag around the benches, their shouts bright against the fading light. Rodriguez looked at him, a rare softness in her eyes. "You know," she said, "when I first saw you that morning, I thought you were a man ready to disappear. Now look at you. You're the reason this city is paying attention." Raymond glanced at the children, then back at her. "I'm just one story." "Exactly," she replied, "and one story can change the way people look at all the others." The words stayed with him long after she left. He realized she was right. His story, once hidden beneath rain-soaked streets and ignored by passing crowds, had become a lens through which others learned to see differently. Later that night, as he prepared for bed, he paused by the photograph of his unit. 12 faces smiled back at him, 7 gone, 5 remaining. He touched the glass lightly, whispering a promise. They finally looked, and they'll keep looking. For Raymond, the journey was not about redemption alone. It was about teaching a city to notice, to recognize, to respect. It was about ensuring that no other veteran would sit invisible in the rain, metal pressed to his chest, dignity dismissed by strangers. The world had shifted, not by policy alone, but by witness, by the sight of an army rising overnight to defend one of its own, by the voices that spoke truth in the open air, by the small choices made in cafes and classrooms and homes. And as Raymond turned off the lamp, the Purple Heart glowing faintly in the moonlight, he knew this truth. When one person stands, an army follows. When one story is told, countless others are heard. And when people finally learn to look again, invisibility begins to fade.